Have you ever found yourself strolling out to your garden in spring with your seeds and tools in hand, only to arrive and be reminded that you still don't actually know how much of each crop you should be growing? Suddenly you start to recall more questions like, did we plant 2 or 3 rows of peas last year? Were the potatoes over there or over here on this drawing? And how many carrots is even the right amount for us to grow anyway? Those scribbles you jotted down on paper a few weeks ago might have helped you feel like you had a plan then, but that plan is far from specific and leaves a lot open for interpretation. Now, a carefree approach like this can work all right for lots of other things in life, but when you're growing your own year-round supply of food, the stakes are a lot higher. Planting the wrong amount of any crop either leaves you with an excessive amount of harvest and labor that you have to deal with somehow, or it leaves you with too little harvest in the summer and bare cupboards in the wintertime. Oh, obviously bare as in empty. Yeah, our kids wouldn't leave their bears in a cupboard anyways. It's much better to scatter them around to try to trip me up. Anyway, both scenarios are going to leave you less satisfied with the practice of growing your own food, and all the time, money, and resources you invest in your garden are not going to feel worthwhile. So the leap I want you to make is to start seeing your garden plan like a grocery shopping list for an entire year. You can wing it if you want to by heading to the store without a list, but how many times have you actually done that and returned home with exactly what you wanted? If you're like me, that hasn't happened very often, if ever. Now, given that having a vegetable garden is just like having your own private grocery store, it only makes sense to start by making a list of the items you want in that store and their specific quantities. To help you get started, I want to inspire you to give the planning phase of your garden work a healthy dose of math. In this short 3-part video series, I'm going to break down the method we use to determine exactly how much of each crop we should be growing. And if your brain started to cramp up a little when I mentioned the math, don't worry, we've got a spreadsheet to take care of all the number crunching for us. Let's get started. So here's a look at our production calculator. This tool can do a lot of wonderful things for us, but right now in part 1, we're just going to focus on setting things up here with this first section that I've highlighted in blue, where we focus on estimating the consumption month by month. So this is, like I said earlier, like making our grocery list for the entire year. And I found that crops generally fall into 3 separate categories here. So we're just going to look at one example of each one, starting with carrots. Carrots is a type of crop that can store pretty well. So we're comfortable storing that on an annual basis, and therefore we eat it pretty much at the same rate throughout the whole year. So this is an easy one where I can just plug in our monthly consumption and it's the same for every month. And the yellow columns here at the end, you'll see do the math for us. They'll immediately add up those totals. If I make a change here, if I think there's going to be a surge in September for some reason, I could up that to 10 and it immediately recalculates. So simple math there, but it's still nice to have that done for you all the time. But that's the first example of a crop that you just eat on a pretty consistent basis. Every month is the same because it stores really well. Next, there are other crops that you're probably just going to want to consume while they're fresh because they don't store very well at all. Lettuce is a good example of something in that category. We can store it for 2 to 4 weeks, but after that, the quality diminishes very fast. So crops like this, we're basically consuming them fresh out of the field. In our climate, the earliest that we can have lettuce coming out of the field would be in May. So that's when our consumption starts, and we consume at a pretty even rate throughout the summer until it's too cold to harvest lettuce anymore at the end of October. And our consumption for our family has been around 1 kilogram per month because we're eating a lot of other greens as well. And the rest of that lettuce row remains empty because we're not growing lettuce indoors at this time. Then there are a few crops that you'll eat seasonally, but they'll also store very well. So that seasonal eating window is actually quite long. Winter squash is a good example of this. So lastly, at the bottom here, we've got winter squash. In our area, harvest for winter squash begins in early September, but there's not really a surge of consumption at that time. We've got a lot of other things to eat too. So our consumption for winter squash is pretty steady as well. And we've got it listed here as 8 kilograms per month. And we found that we can keep our winter squash in good shape for 6 or 7 months. That's why we've not listed any consumption of winter squash for these months, April through August there. So are we harvesting this winter squash every single month? No, we're harvesting all of that winter squash in September, but it's storing well, so we're drawing from that storage to feed ourselves throughout the winter. So that's a good reminder that this chart here, to begin with, is not a chart about when you're going to be harvesting crops. It's just representing when you want to be eating the crops. So for something like squash, where you know there's going to be a surge of harvest in one particular month, That surge is not represented in here all in the same month. You're just writing down what you want to be consuming on a month-by-month basis. We need to get those numbers right first. Once you understand that concept, completing this chart is just a matter of filling in your consumption for each crop on a month-by-month basis and calculating the totals. And if you're using a spreadsheet like this, the math will be done for you. Let's look at our finished production calculator for this season. Every row here is full of numbers, and you see some examples of other crops that are eaten more seasonally, like leeks. That's another one where we're harvesting in September through October, but still storing that crop for a couple of months and eating it steadily through the end of December. You see other examples of us enjoying seasonal crops on a heavy basis, especially if it's one like melons, where we're just gorging on melons for a couple of months while they're fresh. Then you see other crops that we're enjoying on an annual basis, pretty regular quantities like celery here. We're certainly not harvesting celery every month of the year, but we are blanching a ton of that celery at the end of the season and using that to supply our winter needs in soups and stews in the winter months. So our consumption of celery is actually pretty consistent throughout the whole year. Once you've got your consumption estimated for each of these crops, you're finished part one, and you'll be left with your production targets for each of those crops. And that is essentially your grocery list for the entire year. So there's your homework for part one. Write down all of the crops you want to eat from your garden throughout the year. Then month by month, list the estimated quantities you would like to consume, accounting for both fresh and stored produce. And finally, add those numbers up to finish with the total production target for each crop. When that's done, you're ready for the next step. Click right up here to see what we do in part two.